The desert outside is bone-white and merciless, but step through that narrow crack in the red stone wall, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, and the world changes entirely. Cool air sighs against your face. Water whispers somewhere in the dark. Green things cling to dripping stone. Nobody knows this place exists. The wagon had been rolling for 11 days without a single tree worth the name. Josiah Vale sat on the buckboard, with the reins loose in his rough hands, watching the horizon ripple with heat, and thought of something his father had told him the winter before the old man died. "A good place doesn't always look like one," he'd said. "Sometimes a good place looks like nothing at all." Josiah hadn't understood it then. The Arizona Territory in late summer of 1888 was not a country that forgave sentiment. The land near Red Mercy Gap ran in long, tilted shelves of red and orange sandstone, cracked and powdered by decades of killing sun, and the scrub that managed to grow there was gray and brittle and offered nothing to a man with hungry stock. Josiah knew the country. He had crossed worse. But knowing a hard thing and enduring it were different matters, and 11 days of dry camp had worn him to something quieter than patience. Beside him on the buckboard sat Mara, his wife of 7 years, her dark hair pinned back under a sun-bleached calico bonnet that had once been blue. She held a canteen in her lap and did not drink from it, rationing by instinct, watching the horizon the same way Josiah did. Not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of careful attention, the way a person watches a fire they are not entirely sure they have under control. In the wagon bed behind them, Silas slept on a folded quilt with his knees pulled to his chest and one small fist curled near his chin. He was 5 years old and possessed, in Josiah's estimation, the most accommodating spirit of any creature he had ever known. The boy had not complained once in 11 days. He asked questions instead, about the color of the rocks, about why the cactus had spines, about whether lizards got thirsty the same way people did. And Josiah answered them as fully as he could, grateful for the distraction. They had tried Kansas, which had given them 2 good seasons, and then a drought that took everything. They had tried the eastern edge of New Mexico, and where the grassland looked promising until a late frost killed the seedlings 3 springs running. Now they were moving west and slightly south, following a rough, hand-drawn map from a land agent in Tucson who had spoken with cautious enthusiasm about a valley corridor near Red Mercy Gap, good water possibilities, unclaimed ground. The map had grown increasingly vague. The water possibilities had not materialized. It was Silas who saw it first. The boy had climbed to the front of the wagon to sit between his parents in the late afternoon, when the sun came low and red, and the shadows of the rock formations stretched long and strange across the ground. He was chewing the last of a dried apricot and watching the cliff face on the north side of the trail when he pointed and said, without particular excitement, "There's a door in that rock." Josiah pulled the horses up. He stood in the buckboard and shaded his eyes. 200 yards out, a thin vertical shadow cut the face of a massive sandstone wall, a dark seam barely wider than a man's body, running from near the ground up into the stone as far as the eye could follow. It was not a door, but it was something. Mara climbed down before Josiah did. She walked toward it with her hand still on the canteen, picking her way across the rust-colored gravel without hurrying, the way she moved when she was thinking hard and didn't want anyone to interrupt her. Josiah tied the reins and followed with Silas on his hip. The crack was real. Up close, it was even narrower than it had looked, maybe 20 inches at the widest. and the stone on either side rose sheer and smooth for 60 feet or more, and the air near the opening was noticeably cooler, not just shade cool, something else. "You feel that?" Mara said. "I feel it." She leaned close and breathed in through her nose. "That's wet stone." Josiah set Silas down and told him to stay beside the wagon. Then he turned sideways and squeezed into the crack. Inside was dim and close, the walls brushing both his shoulders. He moved forward 10 steps, 15, the passage turning slightly, and then it opened, suddenly, without warning, into a narrow canyon chamber, perhaps 40 feet wide and 150 feet long, sealed on all sides by sheer red walls that caught and held the last of the day's light, like a furnace gone tender. The floor was sand and gravel, scattered with flat stones, and down the left wall, in 3 places he could immediately identify, water seeped steadily through the rock face. Thin streams barely wider than a finger, running down the stone and collecting in shallow basins, worn smooth by years of patient accumulation. Moss grew in dark green ruffles along the damp sections of wall. A single cottonwood had taken root in the back corner, young but real, its leaves trembling in the cool draft that moved through the passage. He stood there a long moment, just breathing. When he came back through the crack, Mara was waiting with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. "Well, you need to see it." She studied his face. "Is it good?" Josiah was not a man who used words loosely. He looked at his wife and at the crack in the stone wall and at the long, dead desert stretching behind them in every direction. And he said, "Mara, I think it might be the best thing I have ever walked into." She went in. She was inside for a long time. When she came out, she sat down on a flat rock and was quiet for a while, and Silas climbed into her lap, and she held him without speaking. They made camp outside the crack that night, too tired and too careful to commit to anything before they'd slept on it. But Josiah walked the perimeter of the canyon wall in the dark, measuring it with his steps, calculating in the back of his mind what could be done with 40 feet of width and the shadow of those walls and 3 separate seeps of clean water. He lay down on his bedroll with his hands behind his head and listened to the desert wind howl outside. Inside the crack, somewhere in that cool red dark, the water ran on without pause. In the morning, he told Mara they were staying. 2 weeks after they began clearing the canyon floor, a surveyor named Haverhill passed along the trail with a mule string and stopped to water his animals from the Vale's barrel. He was a long, sun-dried man who had spent 20 years mapping this country, and when Josiah showed him the crack in the wall, he peered inside, shook his head, and said with genuine but not unkind certainty, "Nothing grows in canyon seeps. Too little light, too little soil. You'll be gone by Christmas." He rode on. Josiah watched him go and then went back to work. The first task was water. Josiah spent 3 full days doing nothing but study the 3 seep points on the left wall, watching the way the water moved, where it collected, where it disappeared into the gravel, and was lost, like he scratched notes on the back of the land agent's map with a stub of pencil. Mara worked beside him when Silas napped, and the 2 of them developed a language of small gestures, a pointed finger, a nod toward the stone, a cupped hand held under a trickle to measure the flow. The largest seep was halfway down the canyon on the left wall, about 4 feet off the ground. It ran continuously, a thin sheet of water spreading across a smooth face of rock before breaking into 3 separate fingers and draining into a gravel basin below. Josiah cleared the gravel basin first, digging down 18 inches and lining the base with flat stones he pried from the canyon floor. He built up the edges with mortared stone, using a simple mix of red clay, sand, and water from the seep itself. And by the end of the second day, he had a basin 2 feet deep and 6 feet across, and it filled completely by evening and stayed full. He named it, in his head, the first basin. He did not say this aloud because he was not a man who named things easily. But Silas noticed him looking at it with something like satisfaction and asked, "Is that our pond, Papa?" "It's our water," Josiah said. "Can I touch it?" "You can." Silas crouched and put both hands flat in the water and laughed at the cold. From the first basin, Josiah cut a shallow channel in the stone floor, chiseling, patient work that raised blisters across both palms, directing overflow toward the center of the canyon where the best soil would go. Mara followed behind him with a piece of tin sheeting they'd carried in the wagon, smoothing the channel bed, and testing the flow with a ladle of water poured from the basin. It worked. The water moved slowly, but it moved, threading the cut stone channel in a thin, bright line. The second and third seeps were smaller, but Josiah treated them the same way. Cleared stone, built collection basins, cut channels. By the end of the first week, all 3 seeps fed into a system that carried water from the canyon walls to a central distribution point near what he was beginning to think of as the garden floor. The soil was the harder problem. The canyon floor was mostly gravel and fine red sand, not much for root structure. Josiah hauled topsoil in the wagon from a dry wash 2 miles south, where wind-blown dust had accumulated over decades into a dark, loamy deposit. He made 12 trips in 4 days, unloading the wagon bed and transferring the soil into the canyon through the narrow crack by the bucket load. Silas helped, carrying small pails that he took very seriously, walking with both hands on the handle and his tongue between his teeth. Mara built the terraces. She had a gift for it that surprised even her, an instinct for how to stack and angle the flat sandstone slabs so that each terrace retained moisture without flooding, caught the sun that reached down between the walls in a long, bright strip during the late morning hours, and resisted the slow erosion of the water channels. She worked with a pair of leather gloves and a steel pry bar, sorting stones by size and thickness, fitting them together with the focused attention she brought to every practical thing. By the end of the second week, the canyon floor held 4 terraced planting beds of raw, dark soil, connected by water channels that fed slowly and continuously from the basin system above. The beds were not large, 12 feet by 6 feet each, stacked at different levels like a broad, rough staircase running from the back of the canyon down toward the entrance. Josiah stood at the entrance crack one evening and looked back at what they had made. The canyon walls were gold and copper in the last light. The water channels caught the sun in thin, bright threads. "It looks like something," he said. Mara came and stood beside him. "It looks like a garden," she said. The planting happened in stages, cautiously, because neither of them could entirely trust what this hidden ground would do. Mara had carried a tin box of seeds across 3 territories, wrapped in oilcloth, packed at the center of her clothing trunk, and she sorted them on a flat stone in the morning light with the reverence of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking at: beans, squash, turnips, onion sets, a paper packet of lettuce, 3 cuttings of grapevine she'd kept alive in damp cloth since Kansas, their roots thin but persistent, a small bundle of strawberry runners from a neighbor's garden in New Mexico, wrapped in wet burlap and barely surviving. She planted the beans and squash first because they were forgiving and fast, and she needed to see something respond before she trusted the rest. The lettuce went into the shadiest part of the lowest terrace, where the canyon wall blocked the brutal midday sun. The grapevines she pressed into the soil at the base of the warmest section of the right wall, where reflected heat gathered in the afternoons, and she trained the first thin tendril against the stone with a length of cord. "They may not take," she told Josiah. "They may," he said. The beans came up in 9 days. 9 days in a hidden canyon in the Arizona desert, in soil hauled from a dry wash by the bucket load, fed by water seeping through ancient stone. Josiah crouched at the edge of the terrace and counted the seedlings, and there were 14 of them, curled and bright and entirely real. He went and found Mara at the water basin and told her, and she closed her eyes for a moment and pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was keeping a feeling in. 14, she said. 14. Silas, who had been listening, said, I want to see." And they took him to the terrace, and he lay flat on his stomach with his chin in the dirt and studied the seedlings with enormous seriousness. "They're little," he said. "They'll get bigger," Mara said. "Will they get as big as me?" Bigger. He seemed to find this very satisfying. The squash followed within a week, broad-leaved and aggressive, spreading faster than Mara expected, and she redirected their growth with careful pinching and a system of low stone borders that kept them from crowding the other beds. The lettuce was lush and tender within 3 weeks, too fast, almost, as if the combination of consistent moisture and sheltered warmth had unlocked something in the ground. They ate it at supper, fresh from the terrace, and Silas said it tasted like water with green in it, and Josiah laughed harder than he had in months. While Mara tended the garden, Josiah worked on the cabin. He had already decided on the back corner of the canyon, where the 2 walls met at a natural angle and the young cottonwood grew. He would use the walls themselves as 2 sides of the structure. The canyon rock was better than any lumber he could afford to haul, and build only the remaining 2 walls and the roof from cut material. He felled 2 juniper trees from the slope outside and spent a week shaping the timbers, notching them by hand, fitting them against the stone with wooden shims and red clay mortar. The cabin took shape slowly, but with a kind of inevitability, as if the canyon had been waiting for it. Josiah cut a window into the south-facing wall and fitted it with a frame of juniper planking, and Mara hung a piece of oiled muslin across it that let in the light while keeping the dust out. Inside, the temperature stayed 10 degrees cooler than the desert outside, even at the height of summer. The stone walls held the cool the way a deep cellar did, releasing it slowly through the day. On the evening, they moved the last of their belongings inside: the trunk, the iron stove, Silas's quilt, the tin box of remaining seeds. Mara lit the stove and made cornbread, and they ate it at a small table Josiah had built from leftover timber, with the canyon walls rising above them and the water running softly outside in the channel. "We live here now," Silas said, with complete conviction. "We do," said Josiah. The harvest from the first planting exceeded anything Josiah had quietly allowed himself to expect. The beans produced heavily through September. The squash filled out to a good size. The lettuce kept cutting and regrowing, and the turnips swelled in the deep amended soil until they were as large as a fist. Mara spread them on the flat stone outside the cabin door and stood back and looked at what this hidden canyon had given them. More food than they'd grown in their last 2 years in Kansas, in a space a stranger would have called too narrow and too strange. She went inside and wrote to her sister in Missouri. "We have found our place." Word moved the way it always did in that country. Slowly, and then all at once, a freighter named Burl Osgood spotted their wagon tracks turning off the main trail and followed them out of curiosity one October afternoon. And after Josiah showed him the garden and the cabin, Osgood spent 3 days telling the story at every settlement and watering stop between Red Mercy Gap and the Tucson Road. He was not a malicious man, but he had a freighter's fondness for a strange tale, and the Vale's hidden canyon struck him as exactly that, strange enough to mention repeatedly. By mid-October, 4 different parties had stopped at the crack in the canyon wall to look. 2 of them were friendly and simply curious. A family named Aldridge, traveling west with their own wagon and 3 children, they stopped for 2 days and helped Josiah extend the water channel to a 5th terrace bed in exchange for a supper of fresh vegetables and cornbread. Their eldest daughter, a girl of 12 named Ruth, spent an entire afternoon sitting beside Mara in the garden, learning how to thin the seedlings and redirect the grapevines, and when they left, she told Mara solemnly that she hoped to have a garden like it one day. The other 2 parties were less comfortable. The first was a rancher from south of the Gap, a broad-shouldered man named Cutter, who arrived with 2 hired hands and spent a long time measuring the canyon entrance with his eyes and asking Josiah pointed questions about water rights and land claim filings. Josiah answered patiently, producing the claim papers he had filed in Tucson before they came out, which Cutter examined with skeptical thoroughness before handing back without comment. He rode away without a word of acknowledgement and did not return, but Josiah noticed him pausing at the canyon entrance and looking back before he disappeared around the rock formation, and the look was not friendly. The second was the surveyor Haverhill again, this time with a different mule string and a different companion. A younger man with a leather case of papers and the careful manner of someone in a legal profession. Haverhill stopped outside the crack in the wall and looked at the water channel running out across the gravel toward the wagon track, and at the smoke threading up from the stovepipe above the canyon wall, and at Silas's small bucket sitting beside the entrance, and he was very quiet for a moment. "You're still here," he said. "Still here," Josiah agreed. "That's the canyon seep place, the one I told you wouldn't grow anything." "It's growing," Josiah said simply. Haverhill looked at his companion, who cleared his throat and opened his leather case and explained that there was a question of water access rights in this section of the territory, that certain parties with prior survey claims had expressed interest in the seep system feeding this formation, and that the Vale family might wish to consult with a land office representative before assuming their existing filing was entirely sufficient. Josiah kept his expression level. "I filed a valid homestead claim in Tucson. I have the papers." "That may be," the young man said carefully, "but water rights in a contested survey zone are a separate matter from land claim filings, and there are individuals who believe the seep system feeding this formation falls within a prior claim boundary." He handed Josiah a folded document. Josiah took it, looked at it for a moment, and folded it back. "I'll look into it," he said. When they rode away, Mara came and stood beside him. "What does it say?" "Nothing good," he said, "but nothing final." The document was a formal notice of competing claim, a legal instrument filed by a land company operating out of Tucson that argued the water seep system feeding the Vale Canyon fell within a survey boundary established 4 years prior. It did not order them to leave. It warned them that if they could not demonstrate both a valid land claim and independent water rights, they could face a challenge hearing before the Territorial Land Office. Josiah rode to Tucson in early November and spent 4 days working through it. He was not a learned man in the legal sense, but he was methodical and he did not rattle easily. He spent the first day at the land office, sitting across a scarred wooden desk from a clerk named Pettifer, who laid out the competing documents with the weary patience of a man who had seen this precise situation many times and expected it to resolve badly for the homesteader. "The survey boundary is ambiguous at the northeast corner," Pettifer told him. tracing a line on a territorial map with his finger. The company is arguing it encompasses your canyon formation, but the survey itself is 4 years old and was done by an outfit that filed 2 other contested claims in the same season, both of which were later invalidated. Then it can be challenged, Josiah said. It can be. The question is whether your own filing establishes occupancy and improvement sufficiently to support a counterclaim. Josiah spent the second day writing a detailed account of every improvement made to the canyon. The water basins, the channels, the terraced beds, the cabin, the plantings. He described dimensions, materials, dates of construction, yields. He wrote it in the careful, thorough hand of a man who had learned that the difference between having something and losing it was often nothing more than documentation. On the third day, he located the original survey report for the competing company's claim and found, as Pettifer had suggested, that the northeast corner point had been placed on a rock formation that did not exist on any other map of the area, a surveying error significant enough to shift the entire eastern boundary line. He brought this back to Pettifer with the relevant maps laid side by side. Pettifer studied them for a long time. "That's a genuine discrepancy," he said at last. "Yes," said Josiah. "This won't be settled today, but I'll tell you honestly, a homestead with the improvements you've documented, on a claim with a cleaner filing than the competing notice, with a surveying error of this magnitude in the competitor's chain, that's a strong position." Josiah rode home on the 4th day in the gray, early cold of November, the horses moving steadily through the desert dark, the stars very bright above the red rock country. He arrived in the small hours and came through the canyon crack quietly so as not to wake anyone, and he stood in the cool dark of the canyon for a moment, listening to the water run and the cottonwood leaves trembling in the draft. Mara appeared in the cabin doorway with a candle. "Well?" she said, the same way she had asked him the first time he came back through the crack from inside. "We're not done fighting it," he said, "but I think we'll win." She held the candle steady and looked at him for a long moment. "Come inside," she said. "There's supper." He came inside, and she fed him, and neither of them said anything more about it that night, because the water was still running in the channels outside, and the beans were still growing in their terraces, and the canyon was still holding them, cool and red and faithful. The letter from the land office arrived the first week of December, and for 3 days, Josiah did not fully understand what it said. Then he read it again in better light, more slowly, and he understood. The competing claims survey error had been formally flagged. The company's water rights argument had been referred for independent review. The Vale homestead claim, given the documented improvements and the valid original filing, was being advanced rather than suspended pending resolution. They were not being removed. The fight was not over. But the ground had shifted. He put the letter in the tin box where Mara kept the seed packets and went to find his son. That night, after Silas was asleep, Josiah and Mara sat outside by the water channel in the cold and talked in the way they rarely allowed themselves. Not practically, not about what needed doing, but honestly, about what they feared. "I keep thinking," Mara said, "about what would happen if they make us go. They won't. But if they did, all of this..." She gestured at the terraces, the dark canyon walls, the soft sound of the water. "We built this. We grew this. From nothing. I know. And it could just be taken." Josiah was quiet for a long time. A cold draft moved through the canyon, carrying the smell of damp stone and the faint green smell of the garden beds. "We built it once," he said finally. "If we had to, We could build it again somewhere else. We know how now." Mara looked at him. "That's not very comforting." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The water ran on in its channel, indifferent and steady. "I don't want to build it somewhere else," she said. "Neither do I. I want this to be ours." "It is ours," Josiah said. "Whatever that letter says, we made this. Nobody made it but us." She was quiet after that, and after a while they went inside. Spring returned to the canyon earlier than it had any right to. The first week of March, the grapevines that Mara had pressed against the warm south wall showed new growth, small, tight, certain, and the strawberry runners that had barely survived the journey from New Mexico put out 2 blossoms from the lowest terrace, white and delicate against the red stone. The land office's independent review came back that same week. The competing claim was formally invalidated. The Vale homestead filing was confirmed. The canyon was theirs. Spring in the hidden canyon arrived in layers, the way good things did, gradually, and then, with a kind of generosity that felt almost extravagant. The grapevines led. By April, they had extended a foot along the south wall in both directions from the original planting, their tendrils finding the small irregularities in the stone and gripping with quiet authority. Mara trained them along a row of wooden pegs Josiah had driven into the mortar joints, spacing them carefully, talking to the vines in a low voice as she worked. Silas asked her why she talked to them, and she said that everything that grew appreciated being spoken to, and he considered this seriously, and then began talking to the bean seedlings in the first terrace with the grave formality of someone delivering important instructions. The beans obliged him by germinating in 6 days. Josiah had spent the winter improving the water system. He'd built a second distribution basin below the first, connected by a short channel with a stone gate that could be opened or closed with a flat piece of fitted slate, allowing him to direct water to individual terrace beds as needed. He'd lined the main channel with a course of flat stone so finely fitted that the water barely lost any to seepage before it reached the garden. He'd also dug a root cellar into the back wall of the canyon, 3 feet into the soft stone, lined with flat slabs, cool enough to store vegetables through the summer without spoilage. When the Aldridge family passed back through in April, heading east after their western venture had not suited them, they stopped at the canyon again and missed her. Aldridge stood in the entrance crack and looked at what had changed since October: the grapevines on the south wall, the expanded terraces, the second water basin, the smoke from the cabin stovepipe. "You've done something here," Aldridge said to Josiah, in the tone of a man revising an opinion. "We've been busy," Josiah said. Ruth Aldridge went straight to the garden and knelt at the edge of the first terrace and looked at Silas's beans with an expression of pure admiration. "He talked to them," Silas told her, very seriously. "That's why." By May, the canyon was producing with an earnestness that sometimes startled them both. The squash in the upper terraces had put out runners that Mara redirected twice a week to keep them from overwhelming their neighbors. The lettuce in the lowest, Oshadius Terrace, had been cut 4 times and kept returning. The onions were fat and strong. The turnips Mara had planted in February were already showing their shoulders above the soil, pale and promising. And the grapevines were blooming. Small, tight clusters of greenish-white flowers pressed along the new growth, and on mornings when the sun came over the east wall and lit the south face in bright slant light, the whole vine glowed, and the flowers filled the canyon with a thin, sweet fragrance that had no right to exist in the Arizona desert, and existed there anyway, stubbornly and abundantly. Josiah planted 2 young fruit trees that spring, a peach and a small apple, in the deepest soil near the back wall, where the cottonwood had spread enough to provide a little afternoon shade. He built stone rings around them to hold water and packed the base with rotted organic material from the compost pile Mara had maintained through the winter. They were small, and their first growth was tentative, but they were real, and they were rooted in the canyon's soil, and that was enough. The summer of 1889 passed the way good summers do, full of work and warmth and small daily satisfactions. The canyon held its temperature through the hottest weeks, its walls radiating a stored coolness through the middle of the day that made the labor bearable and the evenings genuinely pleasant. Silas grew 1.5 inches between June and August and claimed the credit for this belonged to the beans he had grown himself, a position Josiah found difficult to argue against. The grapes turned in August, and they went from green to gold to the deep blue-black of ripe Concord over the course of 3 weeks, and when Mara pressed one between her fingers and tasted it, and her eyes went bright and quiet at once, Josiah knew they had become something they hadn't been before. Not travelers anymore. Not people waiting to find out whether this place would hold them. People who belonged here, definitively, and without qualification, in a hidden canyon in the Arizona Territory that had been waiting in the red rock for exactly them. He did not say any of this aloud. He didn't need to. They harvested on a September morning when the sun came early over the east wall and turned the whole canyon gold, the grape clusters heavy and dark on their trained vines, the last of the squash golden green in their terraces, the bean pods long and fat, the root vegetables waiting below the soil like buried treasure. Josiah built 2 wide harvest baskets from bent willow stems and canvas the previous winter, and Mara had woven a 3rd, smaller one for Silas, just his size, fitted with a proper handle that he could carry with both hands. They worked through the morning without hurrying. Mara moved along the grape row, lifting each cluster with both hands and setting it gently in the basket, and the fruit came away dark and sweet-smelling, and the canyon walls rose on every side, red and gold in the September light, and the water ran soft and steady in its channels below, and the cottonwood spread its bright coin leaves in the draft from the passage. Josiah came and stood beside her when his basket was full, and Silas stood between them, with his basket held in front of him in both hands, his chin just clearing the rim, surveying the harvest with an expression of complete and uncomplicated pride. The 3 of them stood in their hidden canyon in the warm Arizona morning, surrounded by everything they had grown from a crack in a rock wall and a few seeds and an unreasonable amount of faith. "We did this," Silas said. "We did," said Mara. She looked at Josiah, and he looked at her, and the canyon held them the way it always had, close and cool and faithful. Mara stood with a basket of dark grapes resting against her hip, her other arm around Silas, who gripped his own small basket with both hands and would not let anyone carry it for him. Josiah stood on her other side, his harvest basket full to the brim with squash and turnips and the last fat beans of the season. Above them, the red walls rose 60 feet into the bright Arizona sky, and down every damp seam in the stone the moss grew thick and green, and the grapevines spread along the south face, and the water ran on in its channels, faithful and unhurried, the way it had always run, long before they arrived, and now, with any grace, long after.